everybody. Welcome back to our YouTube talk show, Dreams to Destiny. This is episode number 2. Before we start on today's episode, we just want to thank you for all your comments and the friends and family you decided to share our videos with. All this means a lot to both of us. So today, the topic we are going to, or our intent to unpack and talk about, is on marriage. Now, a man and a woman united in purpose through marriage is a strong force to reckon with. Marriage is the nucleus of a healthy society. It's the fundamental unit. When a marriage thrives, basically, a family thrives, the society thrives, and the nation ends up thriving. When there's a prosperous marriage in town, literally, it is going to influence every sphere of our community. There's been a lot of research which says that children who are born to married parents, to a father and mother, they tend to do much better in life, in their young life, in their adulthood. They tend to go through very less problems in terms of their cognitive, academic, emotional health, and even physical health. Number of children who graduate are higher, their employment levels are better, they're more happy even at a professional level. While the children of a parent who is divorced, the research shows that they're 50% more likely to go through even physical health problems. Now, marriage is hard work. It takes intention. It takes discipline to say yes to the same person who we said yes to on our marriage day. On today's episode, our heart is to unlock some of the keys which could lead us to a fulfilled marriage. Not a perfect one, but a healthy one, where the dreams or the destinies is fulfilled. You know, there's happiness, there's peace, there's joy.
So on that note, we want to introduce our very dear friends, David and Nancy. Hi, welcome to this episode of Dreams to Destiny. So we have known David and Nancy for several years now, and we do know that David and Nancy, you have experience in mentoring leaders all over the world for about, I think, 30 years, right? And we also know that you are life coaches as well as marriage coaches. And what we really see in you is this special passion and special desire to really see marriages prosper. Jane and I are looking forward to really dig into that in the next 1 hour or so. But before we get in, would you take some time to say hi to our audience and tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah. Hi, everybody.
Hi. Good to be with you.
Thank you, Jane and Joy, for inviting us to be a part of this. This is a real privilege and an honor to be able to participate.
We love you guys. We love this initiative that you've launched. We've been missionaries. We worked in 5 different nations over 30 years. We've raised 4 children, young adults now, of course. And we've been married for almost 39 years. Our wedding anniversary is coming up in 2 weeks. So lots of life experience, much of it cross-cultural. And we love coaching cross-culturally too. Yeah. And we love the fact that you guys are new Canadians in our nation here too.
And definitely a theme through all of the years. We met working in missions.
Yeah.
And it's always been about discipling and training leaders. And in more recent years, we've focused that primarily within marriages because we feel like marriage is the best place for discipleship to take place. So that's been our focus in the last few years through our ministry called Together.
Yeah. And your theme of destiny and design hits the bullseye for us because we've seen again and again as we've mentored, coached young people, is when they find that sweet spot of understanding their destiny and God's design, that's when the sky is the limit as far as what they can do in God and building his kingdom.
So I can already tell it's going to be a very exciting, dynamic session. So the first topic that we want to unpack together with you is the combination of purpose and marriage. So in the very first episode, we interviewed Dr. John Joseph, and we went deeply into the topic of why is it so important for each person to have a purpose. And we started discussing deeply on the fact that all of us are created to have a very unique and powerful purpose. And right now I want to explore this topic of how is a person's purpose connected to their marriage. And this is for obviously for married people. And
Mhm.
just an opening thought on that, I would say that uh, compared to any other partnership on this planet Earth, marriage is so special and so different, unique, and I would say sacred,
Mm.
right? And so as a married couple, I have a unique vantage point to help Jane, and Jane has a unique vantage point to help me. So I know that Jane has a unique purpose in her life, and I have this unique position to be able to help her realize that, and vice versa.
Right.
Based on your experience in coaching various couples, what do you see? What connection do you see between a person's purpose and their marriage for married people?
Yeah, you said that so beautifully, that you are actually the one, Joey, who helps Jane to fulfill her purpose, and she calls forth your destiny. But of course, there's also a combined purpose.
Mhm.
And we're very much concerned with leaders coming together with their purposes in their marriage and to take on partnering in different projects together.
Yeah, and that, every couple has kind of a hidden agreement between them at the beginning of their marriage as far as what brings them together. And sometimes that agreement is around true God-given purpose, and other times, it's not always on track that way. For Nancy and I, we had the gift of actually meeting on a missions team. So we met within a cross-cultural situation. But we've seen over and over again that we help one another to fulfill purpose. Like, I'm the starter in our marriage and Nancy's the finisher. I'll start a project or a vision or, a building, anything. And a lot of times I'll want to quit halfway through.
You're the ideas guy.
I'm the ideas guy.
So I think if I hadn't married Dave, I would have lived a much safer, more stable in some ways life. But Dave has brought all of these new ideas.
Mm,
And so, of course, he brings me along on all these adventures.
breaks me along.
But sometimes halfway through, Dave might change his mind and might find it hard to finish. But I'm the one that says, oh, no, we started this. We felt like God called us.
Yeah.
And my strength of finishing comes into our partnership, and together it really works well.
Yeah. I mean, that's just a simple idea of how we help one another to fulfill purpose. But yeah, at a very basic level, you marry somebody who has something within them that you sense, especially if you're a believer, will take you into that place of fulfilling your purpose and the purpose that God has for you. And ultimately, as you grow your marriage, that becomes a purpose that you share together. It's not either or, it's both.
Yeah, yeah.
Is what I hear you saying is that so there is a unique purpose in each spouse, and the way you see it happening in your own life is that Nancy, you're able to actually walk more fully in your purpose through being married to Dave, and vice versa. So you're really complementing your unique potential and strengths, God-given potential and strengths.
Hmm.
Right?
Yeah, and you say it so beautifully, Joey, but in the midst of accomplishing that, there is much tension, right?
Right.
Because our differences that drew us together also cause tension. And
Right.
if there wasn't tension in your marriage, something would be wrong, because differences create
Yeah.
tension.
Yeah. It's in the heat. We say it's in the heat of life's moments, life's circumstances, that so often we find purpose. And God has designed marriage so the heat gets turned up a little bit, so that in that tension, in that bubbling, in that I don't really want to go there, God transforms us so we're prepared for purpose, as well as new levels of purpose being revealed.
Yeah, and Joey, you talked about each of us calling forth the purpose in each other. I think the other side of that is we everyone comes into marriage with a level of woundedness and brokenness. And I think God's agenda is to bring us together with a certain person that can heal those wounds within us.
Yeah.
So that's something we've certainly experienced as we've gone along.
And that healing unlocks, again, even a deeper sense of purpose, and also the path to get there. Because so often we see purpose, but our hearts haven't been healed so that we're prepared for that purpose.
Yeah. Wow, beautiful. This is going to be a perfect segue to my second point I want to unpack with you, Nancy and David. So, talking about healing and heart healing, mind healing, identity issues, because we all have a past and we all come into marriage with our own baggages and unhealed issues. I mean, of course, there is a concept of premarital counseling, but we're talking about just one shot, one session or a few sessions is not going to solve the entire the crisis a marriage might go through if the wounds are not healed. Some of the ways even an unhealed wound or some identity issues could manifest in some of our marriages. It could be with ego clashes, hurt, offense. I mean, we're going to be married 10 years in a few months' time. Overall, had a happy, good marriage, although not a perfect one. We thank God for it and all the people who were in our life supporting us. But it took a few years for us to really understand, there's more work to be done, like for us to, learn to partner and grow together in our dreams and God's purposes for our marriage. Especially if we grew up in a dysfunctional home, maybe where the leadership roles were exchanged, where, maybe you had an emotionally absent father or a controlling mother, or we saw our parents disrespect each other, or there was abuse present. If we refuse to deal with some of those issues or go through a healing process or find perspective, there's a high chance those insecurities might manifest in our own marriages in some way or the other. Now, could you share with our audience, Nancy and David, some of some of the struggles you both personally had, even maybe if you're comfortable sharing, before you both got married? And how did you find your healing? How did you overcome it? And maybe even share with our audience, how did it play into your own marriage life? And how did it, evolve or is affecting something which you both are doing today, which is healing and transforming other marriages?
The question you're asking, Jane, is a really fundamental one, because we say that probably 80 to 90% of the hurts and disappointments and misplaced expectations that you bring into your marriage actually were formed, those patterns were formed and shaped within you before you even got married.
Let me reiterate that, because that's a really important stat.
That's a really important
So
one.
as we meet with couples to coach them, they're so convinced that it's the other person that has the problem. Like, I was fine before I got married, and I married you, and now I have all this problem, so it must be your fault.
Must be my fault.
And to hear that stat that we've read over and over in different books, that, hey, 80% of the tension you're feeling between the two of you actually happened, comes from before you even met this person. That's a big thing to bite off.
That is.
Because it's so much easier when I feel pain in my marriage or disconnection from my spouse to say, it's your fault. I want to push the pain on the other. So
And it's not like none of it's my fault, but the deeper healing takes place when you realize how much happened before we got married.
Yeah, so here's an example of what I brought into marriage. So I grew up in a family with 6 children, and I was in the middle, and somehow I got the message that to be loved, I needed to be good, and to be good meant be voiceless, be invisible, don't talk, don't attract attention, and never bother anybody. So I came into marriage not even knowing I carried that script, or that was the role that I played in my family. And yet Dave would provoke that feeling within me of, I would overtalk.
Maybe I'm doing that now. I would overtalk and I would diminish your voice.
And I would feel like, yes, I don't have any power. I don't have a voice. You don't even see me. You're taking up all the oxygen. But the fact that it got exposed in marriage meant that, hey, I can deal with this now because it's been brought to the surface. I think that's God's agenda for marriage, for why he causes us to marry someone who's so different from us. It's the wound first has to be exposed and then God can heal it. And he used you to help heal that too.
Yeah.
Most of our ministry together as a team, that couldn't happen while I was feeling like sidelined and I don't have any influence here.
Yeah. And I actually grew up in a missionary family. So I'm a missionary kid, born in Zimbabwe. And so I had really godly Christian parents, but it was a household in which I was a highly intuitive child. And yet I grew up in a household where I could sense that something was wrong, but I was never given the permission to give, I was never allowed to give voice to that. And so my only option, I really slumped into depression in high school because I believed that the only way to explain the sense that I had that something wrong was, there were things that were wrong within my family. It wasn't a perfect family. I just decided the only way to deal with that was to blame myself. So the problem was with me. And I came into a marriage to Nancy needing somebody to affirm my more intuitive side, somebody that would tell me, that makes sense. I can see based upon your story, your design, who you are, that you're not crazy.
And how did I do in the first years?
You didn't do very well. Because I'm, in our marriage, I'm the more emotional one. I'm emotional, I'm intuitive, I'm sensing. And Nancy was much more rational.
Cerebral.
She's the thinker, which was a real gift to us also.
But over and over again, I would tell Dave, that makes no sense.
That doesn't make any sense.
And reaffirm this wound or poke at the wound that you carried.
Yeah. And we didn't have the tools that we had now in our first 10 years of marriage. So all we would do is we would strike out at one another in our pain, especially our first 3 years of marriage were really painful.
Yes.
Because we were both stubborn, hard-headed, and we didn't have any tools in terms of expressing our feelings and fears and hurts. We just turned our pain on each other.
Yeah. Wow. Amazing we made it.
Amazing that we made it by the grace of God.
But somehow the pain that we experienced and then the tools that we gained to be able to communicate more effectively, certainly.
Yeah.
And resolve conflict and apologize. Those tools are now how we equip other couples. So it's kind of how God has redeemed something that was very painful for us. We're now using that to help others to be able to work through issues in their own marriage.
Yeah. Just to kind of summarize what we said, when it comes to this whole thing of the things of design that are shaped in you before you even get married, I think there is a sense in which you have to recognize your role, the role that's been given you, because
from your family.
From your family, if you don't recognize that role and the script that goes along with it, then you could possibly be living out of a twisted design that isn't really the mantle that God has called you to carry, to live out of. And so really important to separate between what's true that your family passed on to you and what's not true. What's a blessing, as it says in the scripture, and what's a curse. And seeing those things, again, happens through those heated moments, through those points of tension. That's when we see, oh, there's something in there that's twisted, that's not based on truth and God's accurate plumb line as far as our design.
One of the topics we want to talk about in detail definitely is tension. So
Yeah.
we're going to get right into that. The whole
Great.
topic of healed heart was very intriguing, and part of me wants to hover there for longer, but I'm sure we'll get back to it.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about tension and conflict, right?
Mm.
Traditionally, it's seen as something bad. So, for example, in a marriage, if two people are having tension, you would feel that, oh, we're having a problem. But then I was pondering about this a little bit, and also some things that we have learned from you is that uh, tension is really, it's a sign that there's progress or there's movement. I was thinking about this example of the simplistic example of a train, right? When the train is parked at the station, then there's no tension at all. But when the train starts moving and accelerating, you could hear the sound of metal getting stretched, right? And so I think tension is a sign that something's changing, something's moving. And one practical example we went through is just back when we decided to do this show, when we knew that we were going to do it, Dreams to Destiny video series. Jane was really enthusiastic. Okay, let's start next week. Let's get all the equipment and everything, and let's do the first video in August. And I was, of course, figuring out all the logistics and how we're actually going to get it done. And so I could feel the stretching right there, right? So on one hand, tension is seen as something bad, but on the other hand, maybe it can be seen in different light. So what would you say to that based on your experience with coaching and all the experience that you have?
We've seen again and again the tension, particularly in relationships, but also in the circumstances of life, what I would call sometimes heat. Where there's smoke, there's a fire. You know, smoke is the evidence that there's a fire. The tension is the doorway. Tension or heat is the pathway to self-awareness. When I say self-awareness, unlocking those hidden areas of design and dreams and destiny that we didn't even know were there. We both grew up in families where our parents boasted about the fact that they didn't have conflict.
Wow.
And yet we now know, because we have had a lot of expressed conflict within
We have
marriage.
practiced a lot, Dave.
Yeah, we now know and understand even unhealthy conflict
Right.
can unlock areas of desire, dreams, destiny. Having what we call a windshield wiper marriage just doesn't unlock those things.
Windshield wiper marriage is where two people are moving always the same distance apart rather than working together.
Yeah, it's same old, same old. It's predictable. It's a couple who have decided to maximize safety and security and control, to minimize the uncertainties of life. And it means, quite frankly, that you don't unlock those deeper areas of design and destiny, but also intimacy.
Yes, I think you miss out on intimacy when
Yeah.
you refuse to have conflict. You both just disconnect,
Yeah.
stay separate. You miss out on the depth of joy and intimacy that God means for us to have. And when we talk about differences, I always think about, I used to hear in Hollywood when these stars would get divorces, and the reason would be irreconcilable differences.
Yeah.
When we say
Well, good
different
luck. Who doesn't have what feels like irreconcilable differences in marriage?
differences are the grounds for a great marriage. You
Yeah.
know, one marriage author says it that way. The differences and the tension between us, they build my self-awareness. I think that everybody should do things a certain way, and my way is the right way, isn't it? Another line would be, you can be right, or you can be in a relationship. So the fact that Dave does the dishes differently than me, or folds towels differently than me, I mean, those are tiny, silly illustrations, but his different way of doing things helps me to learn about myself. So
Yeah.
the tension is a great means of growing in self-awareness.
Taking the smallest differences in marriage, in keeping house, in raising kids, in living life, in leading a ministry, you take the small things, and under even the small things, the same pattern, the same desire, the same design issues come up again and again. So you can take a very small tension and actually see that it has deep roots within your life.
And so important, Dave, when you see the difference, to be curious about it. So rather than me judging Dave because he does things differently, I can be curious about it and say, tell me where that comes from, Dave.
Yeah.
And yeah, so that's been a great, it makes marriage fresh all the time. So after 39 years of marriage, I'm learning new things about Dave still, partly because he's growing all the time.
Yeah.
But to have that kind of deep conversation over areas of tension and difference. And I think too, part of what Joey talked about, you talked about, Joey, with the differences, and I love the train illustration. No growth happens without discomfort. To be growing and learning has to involve discomfort. We're out of control because we don't know something. And I always think about that line in scripture that even Jesus learned obedience through suffering. Like that's discomfort, that's pain.
Yeah.
And so I love the idea that instead of running away from the discomfort, to lean into it and say, okay, growth is happening right here. Let's stay present. Let's stay with the pain and let's work it through so we reach a new level of intimacy and connection.
Yeah. Yeah, we've seen so often in our own marriage too that sometimes in this whole thing about hidden areas of destiny and design and everything else, so often the temptation is to shut down something in the other person that we don't want to experience within ourselves. So an example for Nancy, I'll talk about her instead of me, is she grew up in a family that shaped her to be highly responsible. And I'm the one in our marriage that tends to be a little more playful, fun-loving. And I remember in the early years of our marriage, especially, your tendency was to shut that part down.
So
just to think, be quiet.
Don't be silly.
Don't be silly. Don't make too many jokes or anything like that. And I think as our marriage has matured, you've realized that there's this shadow self of you that my playfulness is actually awakening. But the initial response sometimes is to not want to experience that part because we've grown up in families again where that part has been shut down or not given permission to thrive. Again, you bring that into your marriage, and instead of receiving who your spouse is and what they offer you in their design to shape, again, the design of your marriage, you shut that down. It's really sad because sometimes both husband and wife can develop a hard heart without even knowing it. They've shut down a part of themselves that where there's been different times in the marriage where there has been an invitation to awaken that part and experience that part. And because a couple hasn't had the tools, they've just or understood the life of grace and learning how to dance well with Jesus. They just shut down that part of the other person that might actually be a gift to them.
How am I doing with welcoming your playful side these days?
You are learning to celebrate and dance and just be silly much more than ever before.
It is a gift to me. You are a gift to me.
And it's been great for our grandchildren too.
Yes.
Because they want your playful side when it comes to being grandma.
Yeah.
You talked about the invitation, right? You might have an invitation to see a different side of your spouse. And I guess tension is basically an invitation in that sense.
It's an invitation to see something bigger than yourself, or to even experience and see through self-awareness a part of yourself that needs to come to life.
So I got reminded of this quote. I think it said, none of us marry perfection, but we marry potential. So the maturity of the spouse is to be healed enough to draw that potential out of your spouse.
Yes.
I like that.
Yes, to welcome their true self out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like you talked about intimacy, right? And then the way you were talking about intimacy is very different from how I've heard it being talked about elsewhere. For example, what first comes to a person's mind when you say intimacy? Maybe it's romance, right? Like being intimate, romance. But I think the way
Yeah.
you talk about intimacy is getting to know someone really deeply,
Yeah.
maybe getting to know yourself as well as your partners very deeply. Uh, is that what real intimacy is?
Certainly, I have to bring my true self to be connected and intimate with Dave. If I am living out of this false self over here, and my false self was like this independent person that didn't have any needs because I was supposed to not bother anybody. And of course, if I live out of that false self, Dave can't know my true self. So
But
there's no.
to bring that self, there has to be a growing sense of self-awareness too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because early on in I would say, honestly, in the first 10 years of our marriage, because I was the more intuitive one, but unhealed, I must say that, an unhealed intuitive, a lot of times I would interpret Nancy and I would tell her what I thought she was going through instead of listening to her, asking her questions. And it just didn't work. I mean, there has to be a desire to grow. And she had that desire, no question, to grow in self-awareness. But my methodology out of my unhealed self was not the way that enabled you to live out of the deeper self-knowledge, self-awareness that builds intimacy. Because it's the same in our relationship with God, isn't it?
Well, that's the thing. Our relationship here is, there are many similarities in our relationship with God. When we meet with couples, and usually they're Christian couples, very often they think, my relationship with Jesus is great. It's just this one that's really bad. And we challenge that because this is God with skin on to me. And if I distance myself from Dave when I feel disappointed or hurt, you can almost guarantee that I do that with the Father.
Yeah.
That with God, I also distance myself. I'm closing my heart off to him. But
and our lack of self-awareness here between you and me reflects our lack of self-awareness. That's why so many of the theologians in the church, at least really wise theologians, we think,
know God,
know God,
to know yourself,
to know yourself, know yourself,
to know God. Yeah.
There is a growth in self-awareness, knowing yourself, that gives God access to even deeper places in that internal world, and it grows your knowledge of him.
So part of why God loves marriage is that we learn intimacy and connection with another human being, and then we transfer it. Because as I've experienced being loved and accepted and welcomed to be myself by Dave, of course I can be more my authentic self with God. And it's not just I learn it here and then I learn it here, like it's an intertwined journey.
Yeah.
But I want to go back to that word intimacy, that I'm intrigued by Joey's question.
Yeah,
and
let's go back.
How do you describe intimacy, or how would you describe it, what we experience in our marriage? I mean, people think about sexual, but we're not.
Think about sexual romance. Of course, that's part of it. But yeah, I mean, the words that I've read so often are intimacy, into me, see. It's intimacy is ultimately, and it's uncomfortable. It's when I know that you know me, that you read me well, and yet you do that with kindness and respect and honor, even though I can't hide my hurt from you anymore. I can't hide my fears from you anymore. You read me well. In fact, we had some tension just the other day, and I was creating some distance because I expected Nancy to kind of create distance too by saying, I don't really get what you're going through and why you're reacting. And she apologized, I remember, and you added to the apology a clear description of what I went through and how I felt in that situation, where it totally disarmed me.
And I said, that makes sense to me, which is
I know,
your...
it was like, it totally disarmed me. And I thought, that's intimacy. That's intimacy, when in a tense moment, I can actually say, you know me well, and yet still treat the unhealthy parts of me with kindness and respect.
It's total.
Just like God does.
Yeah.
That's the life of grace, right? He calls us to holiness, and yet he loves us where we're at. It's, I mean, how you resolve that tension, nobody has ever been able to, but both things are true.
So on that note, I just want to unpack this topic on COVID has actually brought in a lot of stress onto marriages. The divorce rate has spiked in pretty much all the countries in this pandemic, which is a very unfortunate thing to watch. What do you think could be some of the reasons? I mean, none of us go into marriage thinking, okay, one day I'm gonna cheat on my spouse. Some of the top reasons why a marriage go through separation across the board are infidelity, abuse, financial issues, etc. Yeah, so could you just share some of your thoughts? Because with COVID, what's happening is, some of the ways married couples used to handle their stress before, or, used to ventilate their stress, it's absent from their life. And they will have to come together inside a room with all the social restrictions and the isolation happening, and they will have to, face some of their differences head on.
Yeah.
So what do you think might be missing here? Because COVID cannot directly, increase the rate of divorce across the world.
I think when couples are trapped by COVID, you really are left with yourself and your spouse. And you can no longer medicate with busyness, workaholism, entertainment, going to sports events, so many some of us still shop, but with the mask on. But so many of those things, those extra things that we think make us feel better, a little more satisfied, more fulfilled, all those things are being stripped away. So you're left with yourself. If you don't want to do the work of building your marriage or building greater self-awareness and pushing through the noise to actually know what's going on inside you, then it's a time of high anxiety.
And I suspect, we know that COVID has added a layer of stress to the world.
Yeah.
So definitely each marriage would have another layer of stress, but I suspect that the stopping of the other activities and us being confined to our homes more has exposed tension that was already there.
Yes.
And in one sense,
it's pre-existing.
This is such a gift that we would be able to say, here's a tension and let's talk it through, let's work it through.
Right.
But some, of course, are thinking, well, this guy must be the problem, so I'm leaving. And we know that subsequent marriages are even less likely to thrive and survive. Divorce rate is even higher in secondary marriages.
Right.
But it's an opportunity to be able to work through those stresses that get exposed when we lose, as you said, the entertainment, the social, the work, and then we are just together with the two of us.
But I think a lot too. This is getting a little bit philosophical, but I think some of it has to do with the fact too that couples and individuals are facing the fear of death, right? Because COVID is weird. It does disproportionately affect older people with pre-existing medical conditions, and yet there's this climate of fear, the fear of death, the fear of bankruptcy. Maybe we won't have as much as we expected to have. Some people are going through unemployment. It's touching upon all these fears where people just don't know what to do. They're looking down the barrel of the gun and thinking this could be worse for my health, for my family's health, I think a lot of it is fueled by the fear of death. You know, you bring that into a marriage context, and you're talking about much more than just paying our bills. You know, that's one of the primal fears that people carry, the fear of death. And I think that's being stirred up too. And people are thinking really deeply about life and purpose and destiny and meaning, because looking at the shortness of life does that.
It's like a lot of support systems that used to be there, like, say, for example, having a job and having a social circle. All of those things are sort of getting affected. Things that people have their security on is getting shaken. And people are forced to spend more time together, more time in the common space, and less time away from each other. So that might be aggravating some of the differences.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's a good segue to our next section.